I think a lot of times when I say ignore your thoughts, I get a lot of mixed reactions. And, I can just as easily say observe your thoughts and sort of play it safe and not trigger, I guess, some sort of inner conflict where people are getting really confused. But the key in what I'm saying is when I say that, people become very provoked because they're attached to their inner voice. And when I say ignore your thoughts, I'm not saying all thoughts are bad. I'm not saying all thinking is completely horrible, but I'm saying it's not necessary. It's not a fundamental part of who you are. If someone doesn't struggle with overthinking, if someone's thoughts have no hindrance on their life, who am I to say or who am I to tell them to completely detach from all of their thoughts? And not every single sort of mindfulness practice applies to every single chapter or part of our life. But for someone who is constantly overthinking and constantly experiencing thoughts that they don't want to have and they don't want to engage with, it's easier just to detach from the inner voice as a whole. And that is the truth of the matter. We are awareness, we are the observer of our thoughts. Does this mean we always have to exist in that state? No, and it depends on person to person. The reason that a conversation and a statement like ignore your thoughts provokes so many people is because there is still a very deep rooted attachment to thought. And what happens is a lot of people who haven't yet engaged in these sort of meditation practices and a lot of people who haven't maybe experienced thoughts that turn really sour and start creating a lot of conflict in their lives is they start to think, no pun intended, they start to believe that it's a bunch of ridiculousness because they gain a lot from their thinking mind. Maybe, after an argument, they think about it and they spend time engaging in their thoughts and stuff, and they come to the realization that maybe they were in the wrong or maybe they should apologize. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But what someone has to understand is you're not engaging with yourself, you're engaging with your mental processing. You're engaging with the system and the biological product that is your mind. You're not talking to yourself. You are tapping into these different areas of your mind. You're the place where your brain holds memories and the place where your brain signals emotions and all these different sort of facets and areas of your mind. That's what you're conversating with when you're reflecting and when you realize, oh, maybe I should have apologized to that person sooner. Maybe, or maybe on the opposite, maybe that person hasn't been treating me well, whatever it is. When we spend a lot of time in our thoughts, we're not talking to a mirror, we're talking to a system. And that's the big difference that a lot of people don't understand. And they think that because they're spending so much time in their thoughts and because maybe they even gain from thinking and they believe that that brilliant idea that they had came from thinking, it really didn't. There's such nuance to how the mind operates, and the line between awareness and a sort of inner reflective voice can become very blurry. But I've said this before and I'll say it again, your soul doesn't speak English, your soul doesn't speak language, awareness doesn't speak language. This doesn't mean you can't be properly represented when you think of something before you do it. For example, you think, what am I going to eat? And then you think of a specific restaurant. That's not necessarily not a representation of you, but it's just simply a choice that you're making to present yourself in that sort of subset of language and subset of words to get a certain message and desire and wanting across. You know, Language and thoughts, they take us from Y to Z and from one point to another, but they're not inherently necessary. So if someone was, I don't know, maybe deaf and they don't think in worded language and thoughts, they can still think that same mental process that you just did. They can still ponder what restaurant they want to go to as a result of feeling that hunger. And it's not the fact that you can think in language that allows you to sort of arrive to that conclusion and to create that sort of paradigm where you're arriving at that destination. It's not the words themselves, it's the mental equation and processing that is happening. And you could do that with images as well. So a person can imagine that restaurant, they can remember the food of that restaurant, they can remember the name of that restaurant. But it doesn't necessarily mean there needs to be a a conversation that you could hear in your mind happening. Those two aren't necessarily synonymous, and they're not really necessary. So that leaves us with kind of two separate scenarios at hand. The person who is struggling and the person who doesn't want to experience any of the thoughts, and the person who is seriously wondering what is the benefit in getting rid of my thoughts if they cause me no harm. And it would be kind of negligent to think that one answer applies to both. For the person struggling with overthinking, they would benefit greatly from detaching from thoughts completely. No thought is worthy of participation. Even a good thought, for the first kind of few months that you're practicing it, they don't even need to be engaged in. If you don't engage with a single thought, you will arrive at a quiet mind the quickest. That's sort of the ASAP and fastest route to a quiet mind and to a more peaceful and sort of action and experience driven life. And then for someone who doesn't really struggle with thoughts but is looking to, I guess, deepen their mental state and they're looking to get into meditation, but their thoughts don't really bother them and most of what they're doing is out of curiosity rather than desperation. There's a sort of lighter paradigm and system in place. And actually, sometimes if you do find yourself on this boat, if you are one of the maybe people who are listening to these episodes and you're saying, I struggle with other stuff, but my thoughts, I don't really struggle with my thoughts. My thoughts don't really say things that are too bad. You may find an easier time actually experiencing the thoughtlessness and sort of the flow state. And what you can gain out of this sort of thoughtless state is the benefit that you've been looking for in your difficult emotions. So it's not necessarily that thoughts themselves are the problem for some people and that what they say is the problem for some people, but it's the fact that maybe it's just a distraction and that can still be a gateway to experiencing a deeper and more sort of blissful state rather than being entangled in thoughts that aren't bad, but they're certainly not useful. The more we sort of detach from our thoughts, the more we sort of start to create that distance, we're going to see that once you get over the initial belief that needs to be ingrained that you are not your thoughts, once you sort of get over that, you're going to see that it's not as difficult to not engage with the thoughts as it is to not let them deter you from actions, as I say all the time. Because, you may think that you engaging and you constantly conversing with the thoughts are the biggest problem, but what it really is probably preventing you from doing is leaving your comfort zone. It's keeping you trapped in fear, and it's not allowing you the space to live your life and how you want. It's creating a lot of opinions and sort of voices that you need to listen to instead of listening to that intuitive, sort of just action-driven guidance that we all naturally have in being human. A good sort of metric and a good mantra we can kind of go by is if, for both people who are struggling with irrational and bad thoughts, and even those who are just sort of curious what the thoughtless process may feel like or what the flow may feel like, we can say if you can't control a thought, it's certainly not yours. So if a thought comes into your awareness and you have no say in the matter of what that thought said, you did not choose to think the thought you just thought. That's a crazy sentence, think the thought you just thought, but the point still stands. Then how can it possibly be yours? If you get hit with a flying baseball that's coming from 100 yards away and you get hit in the arm, how is that your fault? You didn't control that. You didn't control where that baseball was coming from. And we think just because the mind is in our body, just because we have a mind, means that every single thought that rises to the surface of our awareness is somehow ours to possess. You may say, well, why am I thinking that thought and not anyone else? Well, there can be a very complicated and nuanced answer. Your brain chemistry could be wired in a certain way, your stress levels and your energy levels and the way you sort of engage with life and how your brain operates naturally and genetically and all these different factors. We can say why a million times, but the fact still stands that if you can't control a thought, it's certainly not yours. And I am under the grand impression that if any thought pops into your awareness, it is not ours to possess, even when we do feel a sort of intention behind it. Though I know for sure, and sort of neuroscience knows for sure that if you can't control a thought, if it comes almost out of nowhere, it is certainly not yours. Certainly not. How can you become influenced and how can you possess something that isn't yours? This is where detachment comes into play again. So they say, how do I detach from my thoughts? Well, if you didn't think it, if you didn't want to think it, it's not yours. It's just like a brain fart. It's a brain burp. It's just noise. It's just static. It's the bubbles that rise and spark out of the pot when a boiling pot of water is coming to arise. That's the simplest way to put it. And that's sort of the comments I get a lot is I'll say to detach from thoughts and people will keep saying, how do I detach from thoughts? It feels so impossible. But I'm telling you right now, the ingrained belief that the voice in your mind, just because it sounds like you, when it says things that you did not want to say, just because it sounds like you, it doesn't mean it's you. You're still you if you lose your voice, right? So the way you talk isn't you. Your voice, the way you linguistically project yourself, isn't you. You didn't choose to think the thought, so it's also not you again. So why are we clinging to these thoughts? And again, I mentioned this in a different episode, but we also somehow believe that our thoughts can tell the future. I mean, that's another ridiculous thing. We need to get down to the facts of the issue here. And we're so caught up in what the thoughts say and the emotions and the sort of human element of it all. We have to recognize the psychological facts. When you look at the real life sort of data of what we know about the mind, this is what it is. The suffering is real, the misery is real, but everything else isn't. We're suffering at the result of having misplaced beliefs. We still believe we are our thoughts. And because we believe that we are our thoughts, we suffer. It's simple. And the way that we disengage this belief and the way we detach from thoughts is by not reacting to them. If you get hit with a baseball from far away and you have no one to blame, you have no idea where it came from, who are you going to blame? You're definitely not going to blame yourself, right? So we're always looking for someone to blame for these thoughts. We're looking for something to blame. That's why we always create the inner enemy sort of narrative, because we're looking for someone to point the finger at for why am I experiencing so many bad thoughts? But there's no one to point the finger at. There's no one to spill hatred towards. There's no enemy. It's just biology. And we can overcome it through awareness. Many people have done it to varying degrees, to varying levels of freedom. You can't let your temporary emotions stop you. I'm going to say something and I want you to feel empowered by it. You don't have to master the world. You don't have to master the universe. You only have to master yourself. If you can overcome yourself, your own fear, your own thoughts, your own emotions, if you can overcome yourself, you can have anything you want in this world. And I know that sounds a little bit ridiculous. And I know I'm getting a little bit sort of existential and I'm getting a little bit, I guess, spiritual in the sense, but it's the truth. And the people who have achieved many great things, and I don't mean achieved by success, I mean in terms of artwork, I mean in terms of emotional freedom, happiness, any form of success that you want to put it in, anyone who has achieved anything, they know this. Even the miserable, suffering artist, they're overcoming themselves by making the art. They're overcoming a part of themselves within making the art, but they're missing the part where they have to actually enjoy life. So everyone who has ever done anything has had to leave their comfort zone, has had to let fear not bond them to a comfort zone that is a prison. And for many of you listening, you probably think some people have it easier. And it may be true. Some people naturally don't experience as many negative thoughts. Some people naturally don't worry as much, aren't as anxious, aren't as scared. That's the truth. But they have their own other stuff going on too that they have to overcome. People will suffer more than you. People will suffer less than you. It that stuff, it doesn't matter. It's about what you're going through. And you need to overcome your thoughts. You need to overcome your emotions, your fear. You can't worry about other people's suffering. I mean, you can concern yourself with it, you can empathize with it, but you can't hold yourself to the standard of other people's suffering. You can't think that because someone suffers less, they have it easier, and you can't think that someone who suffers more has it worse. And I'm talking about emotional suffering here. Those things might be true, but who is to say? Who is the judge in emotional suffering and misery and all this psychological sort of stuff? Who's to say? We can't compare our suffering to other people, and we need to mind our own self. And when we become satisfied with our life, when we overcome those thoughts, when we detach, when we don't let fear hold us back anymore, when we truly feel that sort of satisfaction in our lives, different areas of our life are finally moving, we're evolving, we're growing. We can see that things are changing as a result of us overcoming our fearful and anxious thoughts. Once we see that and we start to become satisfied with what our life is turning into, the comparison starts to dissipate. And the worrying and the anxious and the forcing other people to act in a certain way and all this sort of control, all these other things that we're dealing with, we don't even realize how much of it boils to us still being a victim to our own thoughts. We don't realize that. Because once you're satisfied with your life, and not satisfied as in you don't want to achieve or evolve or grow anymore, but satisfied as in you know that you're capable. And you know that whatever comes your way, you're also capable of overcoming that as well because you've done it. And you realize that for long as you don't let your thoughts bond you to one room or one area or one limitation, you can always grow past whatever burdens you. Emotions are complex, and we need to feel emotions, and we need to sometimes maneuver our way through them, but thoughts are not. Ignore your thoughts if you wish. I have, and I still do often. Do I ignore every single thought? If I could, I probably would. But I still get caught in the loop sometimes. I still get caught, thinking thoughts. But as soon as, and I will say this, as soon as I recognize that a pattern is starting to unfold, fear is starting to arise again, I ignore those thoughts completely. I don't ignore the feeling, not the emotion, not the fear. You could feel that. You could sit with that. You could recognize what is causing it, what is triggering it. And then you have two things to do. Number one, ignore all the thoughts as a result of that fear. Don't engage with any of them because it's all nonsense. They're going to try to predict some ridiculous, fearful doomsday scenario that's never going to happen. So ignore the thoughts. And the second thing you do is don't let that fear, whether it's a new fear or an old fear, don't let that hinder you from making the choices that you would have made if it weren't a factor. And that is so important. That is so important. Doing what we want instead of choosing something because our fear and anxiety told us to, those things are so important because it shows our mind the person we are. It actively changes our life in a inner way, and as well as how we're existing and creating and maneuvering our way through the system of reality. It is so important. So we are not our thoughts, and we have to continue to embody this philosophy, and it will take less time than you think. If you guys enjoyed this episode, let me know what you guys want me to talk about. I'm open to talking about different things. There's going to be new episodes every day this week, Monday to Friday, and sometimes on Saturdays. And you guys can find me, Kinzer MB, everywhere. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube, thank you for watching. If you're listening on Spotify, thank you for listening. You can find my books at shop-kinzer.com or on Amazon. Kinzer MB everywhere. And thank you guys. I appreciate you. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.